I'm Mr. McBrien. This is TEJ3M, Drivers. The Ontario curriculum would like for us to be able to describe the changes that are required when we upgrade hardware components or features of a computer system. This is what we'll talk about today. So for starters, we need to understand what these things drivers are. Every hardware device needs an interpreter. It needs to have documentation of some standard modes of communication to allow it to talk to a computer and allow the computer to talk to it. And any given piece of hardware will have some things that are unique to just it. So we have to teach operating systems how to talk to a given device. So let's imagine that we're developing a new piece of hardware today. So a manufacturer decides to develop something new. They have to decide who's going to use it. If it's not going to be a standalone device, and these are more and more rare these days, they have to decide what platform will interface with it, whether it's Linux, Windows, Apple, or some custom devices that'll interface with it. When they make that decision, then they have to decide what versions of each one of those systems will interact with it. And finally, which architectures. And typically, for each platform version architecture combination, there has to be a unique driver coded to allow for communication. For this reason, some hardware manufacturers will simply make the decision not to support some operating systems or platforms. So we have to go out there then, if we have a new piece of hardware, and we have to find the right driver for it, the right interpreter for a given piece of hardware for our system. The good news here is that modern operating systems are designed to find the right driver fairly automatically. So for Windows 7, we start add a device, and we follow the wizard to go ahead and find that driver. And most modern operating systems have some version of this workflow, some tool that'll help you find that driver. So if your computer is connected to the internet, and if your device is configured correctly on your computer, the system should find a driver automatically from the manufacturer. But in some cases, it won't be possible to do this. It may be an old piece of hardware, or it may not be completely compliant with this workflow. When this happens, we have to manually search for the driver online. Now, there's one key point when it comes to this. Wherever possible, get your driver from the manufacturer's website directly. If you don't, craziness can ensue. All right, so obviously we're concerned with Linux in this class because of our Linux build. Now, the Linux user base is smaller than the Windows user base. In addition, there are lots and lots of different flavors of Linux. And so there are some manufacturers who simply don't see enough value in creating a Linux driver for their tools. Linux drivers, however, can be found for many devices, coded by the Linux community, but it is hit or miss whether this will happen. So if you have a given piece of hardware and you want to run it on Linux, it may simply not be possible. And for this reason, many Linux aficionados go ahead and run a dual boot system, and so have some version of Windows, whether grudgingly or happily, available on a different partition on their hard drive so that they can run given pieces of hardware. Now, installing Windows from a generic installation can actually disable key components, even key components as integral to the function of the computer as network or graphics cards. So you may find these things not operating optimally if you reinstall Windows from a generic disk. So we may have to go and download drivers for those components before our build computer will display optimally and before it'll connect to the internet. Now here's a tip. If you're going to reinstall Windows on your computer, it's a good idea to go and find all the drivers for the hardware that you have and place that on a USB flash drive before you start the reinstall of Windows. Now, you may have bought a new computer recently. You didn't have to do this. You didn't have to go and find drivers for your network card and for your video card in order to have your computer work well. You simply install Windows from a disk. The reason for this is that Microsoft has an agreement with most computer manufacturers to allow those manufacturers to include key drivers in the Windows installation, and they include those to their users as part of a specialized OEM copy of Windows. Now, if you buy a computer, it's a good idea to back up that version of Windows because it contains all those drivers as part of its basic installation. So make a backup of that version of Windows and keep it safe, because that ISO of Windows is designed for your computer and will have it up and running a lot faster than using a generic installation later. So if you buy a computer package, it'll almost always be bundled with an operating system. It'll often be pre-installed, so the disk is not shipped with the computer. This is just to save cost. As soon as you purchase that computer, you should go to the manufacturer's website, not Microsoft. Go to the manufacturer's website and download that ISO for your computer. You'll need the serial number for your computer to do so. Burn a DVD of that operating system, keep it safe. It has all the drivers for your computer as it came shipped from the manufacturer, and it's the easiest way to get your computer up and running quickly. Now, if you're not sure if this is legal, it is absolutely legal. You have a license for Windows for this computer as part of that OEM package. So this is completely legal to use this copy in the future on that computer. Now, this is great, and if you don't make many modifications to your computer, this will be an extremely effective way to be able to reinstall Windows at a later date if you want to. However, as soon as you start using a computer, the installation of Windows starts deviating from the default settings that were on it. They might be your preferred keyboard settings. They might be your favorite Office configuration. Or it could be the drivers for your printer, all kinds of other different customizations of Windows. And often users don't even notice as they're making these customizations. Now, each customization that you make, every piece of hardware that you install, every change in setting, this work will be lost if you have to reinstall Windows at a later date. If something happens to your Windows installation, it gets corrupted, your hard drive fails, all of those specialized things that make your computer yours will be gone. You don't have to go back to that OEM version. You don't have to go back to that default version that doesn't have your personal fingerprints. There is a tool inside Windows for you to back up not just Windows, but your version of Windows. So you can create your own system image, create this backup, and if anything ever happens to your installation of Windows, you can return Windows back to that date at which you made the backup. So this is a very good idea to go ahead and create that backup of Windows once you have everything working the way you want to. Now, if you didn't make a copy, manufacturers are expected to retain copies of their Windows ISO. If you've still got your registration numbers, you should be able to go back to the manufacturer's site and download the correct ISO for your computer. Today, as of when this movie was made, Windows 7 ISOs were still generally available from the manufacturer, but with Microsoft retiring Win 7 in 2020, this is going to change very quickly. So if you're a Windows 7 user and you haven't already downloaded an ISO, you probably want to get to that. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about problems with computers. If you have a piece of hardware that stops working, one potential cause is just a corrupted driver, so the interpreter is no longer working with your system. Before you go out and buy a new, what have you, you name it, piece of hardware, new webcam, new document camera, new scanner, new printer, before you go and replace that component, it's a good idea to try to update or reinstall the driver for that component. Now, a tip about installation of printers and printers in general. To save costs, many printer manufacturers have now started offering universal print drivers that are intended to work for any kind of their printer. When you are installing a printer, resist the temptation to install these universal print drivers. Often they don't work for your special flavor of your printer or don't work optimally. It's a good idea to find the driver specific to your printer, and this one should work the best. Now, as far as finding drivers for given components when Windows doesn't automatically configure them, in Google you want to do a search specifying what you've got, the operating system, and the piece of hardware, and try to be as detailed as possible. And include, of course, the word driver. Once you have a result, you're going to see a bunch of different options for where you should go. Look for a website from the manufacturer of the hardware, if at all possible. Try to avoid any other suppliers. If you take your driver from someone else, you may find that they offer you an additional bonus of malware, free of charge. So the good news here, by the way, is that Google will help you out, suggesting options for completing a given request. And in here we can see some generic offerings, www.driver-wireless.com versus acer.com, the official site. We want to resist the temptation to look at that other fairly official looking website. Now, most drivers, you can simply copy them to your machine and run them. Some drivers may need to be called, specified from the Add a Printer Windows utility. You can go through this process pretty easily and should be fairly comfortable with this by the end of the course. Okay, so key points today. Virtually no piece of computer hardware works without a driver. These drivers are specific to the operating system, the version, and the hardware type. When we use generic ISOs of operating systems, we won't have the computer-specific drivers for even the most basic components like a network card. So wherever possible, we want to install the OEM, the original equipment manufacturer ISO, so that we'll get as many of the drivers as we can for our computer as soon as we're done installing. The good news here is even those drivers that don't install successfully, modern operating systems have made it easier and easier to find the drivers we need. Okay, so that's it for today. For your homework, please complete your build, and I want you to start navigating through the BIOS. So go ahead and open the BIOS as soon as you've got your build operational, and if possible, get your Windows installation in place. Thanks very much. Have a great night.